Hi, welcome to FedScoopTV. I'm Colby Hockney. I'm sitting here with LaForest, Senior Director at Mongo DB Federal. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Great. I'm going to start off with, what are some of the trends you're seeing in open source technology?
Well, obviously I'm on the vendor side, but one really important trend that I have been seeing is really sort of a maturation in the business model. And I think this has a lot of knock-on effects, but if you think about it, obviously sort of Red Hat cracked the model as far as open source technology and monetizing a technology and providing great value for their customers. I think one thing we've seen, sort of above and beyond the traditional, well, I'm going to provide support because I'm the expert in the technology, is sort of more diversification in how they are using a technology from a business model perspective. So, for instance, one thing we're seeing more of is tooling. Right? If I'm a company, I'm essentially giving away my software for free, right? Or I'm supporting a product that I can't sell. So how do I pay my engineers, right? And how do I pay the people that answer the phones, et cetera? So tooling is one way that's becoming more popular. But I think the other interesting trend that I'm seeing is SaaS. So in other words, I think it makes a certain amount of sense from a business model in the sense that, right, the same logic that would apply to why a Red Hat or, for instance, MongoDB is the best company to provide you support for a technology, i.e. they are the experts, they are the ones that write it and they understand it, is really the same logic as to why it would be the best company to create a hosted solution, right? Presumably, they know the best way to configure it, the best way to deploy it, to scale out, et cetera. So that's another sort of aspect that I'm seeing. So this maturation, I think, from a business model perspective, means that more companies are actually considering that, right? If I'm creating a product and I want to figure out how I'm going to release it, it's becoming a more attractive option. I think moving beyond sort of the business model, I think something that's really exciting is that the government agencies themselves are now getting really on the bandwagon, right? My perfect example is CFPB, which is really Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They're really on the cutting edge here, right? So they specifically make an effort to open source everything they create, if possible, right? And this has really a lot of value. So for instance, they've created really, I would say, a data as a service platform, but it's really perfect for open data. And that's a big theme, right? Government agencies need to get their data available for other agencies to consume or even the commercial market. And Q, which is a platform they built for this, is designed to allow you to easily load data in, serve it up from machine to machine. It's built on MongoDB and other open source technologies, and they've pushed it out to GitHub. And then from our perspective, we say, well, this is great. I want to help other government agencies with their open data problems, so we're going to help. We're going to enrich this capability that they've created, which really is more sophisticated than any of the other commercial offerings out. And it was created by a government agency. Obviously, you're familiar with, for instance, NSA, right, who has open sourced some of their efforts. So we're seeing more and more of this, and it's really, really exciting because it has great implications from the taxpayer's perspective, right? You don't want two government agencies creating the same thing. So, and then finally, I think the other trend that I've noticed is sort of in the wild creation of stacks, like technology stacks. I mean, so traditionally, think of a technology stacks, a lot of times there was one vendor that was creating it. They were trying to get every single piece of the software up the stack. So Red Hat's a good example of it. They got a lot of quality products. But now what we're seeing is sort of naturally stacks be created by developers and people just using it in the wild. And this means all open source stacks. And this really means that there is a wide breadth of mature open source technologies, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible. Examples obviously on the infrastructure side go from OpenStack to things like the LAMP stack, or even the one thing I'm seeing on the application development is the mean stack, which is really hip and cool. It's what all the cool kids are doing, not me, which is like Mongo and Express.js and AngularJS and Node.js. So that's really a good sign for the open source.
Right. So it sort of leads into my next question. What areas in the government have you seen the quickest adoption of open source?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a mission area perspective, so I would say the intelligence community, as is often the case with technologies and innovation, is sort of at the tip of the spear in one sense, right? In that they are using a lot of open source technologies and they were quick to deploy it, and certainly MongoDB is no exception. It has a lot of adoption there. But then, across the rest of the government, we see fairly variable adoption. So, you'd be surprised some places where it is adopted and some places where it's not, I think, for instance, labs are a great example because they have to do a lot of stuff, research, important missions, but on a very lean budget. And yet their risk assessment criteria is different, right? They're a little bit more willing to try something that hasn't been beaten around in the government for 30 years, right? And then finally, I would say, from actually technology perspective, not thinking about it on a government-to-government agency, one area where it's getting a lot of adoption is in big data, right? I think this is out of necessity, right? Because if you think about big data, right, it's all about how do I take a lot of computational resources and apply it to deal with massive amounts of data. Technologies have to scale quite clearly, right? But if the business model doesn't scale, it doesn't do any good. So as a Mongo DB, for instance, it's all well and good for me to tell a customer, it's like, sure, you can put a petabyte worth of data, and trillions of records inside of a database across 1,600 servers. Well, if you have to pay 6 figures for each server, it's just not feasible. So the actual requirements of big data sort of pushes people towards open source. So specifically in that field, that's why you're seeing that the technologies like the Hadoop and MongoDB are open source. They have to be, out of necessity. The government couldn't afford it otherwise, or commercial companies.
Right, and so what do you think that private sector can learn from the way that government has implemented open source? Yeah,
it's kind of interesting. I mean, I think I think in the DoD, for instance. So typically, when you think about government, you think about people being very deliberate and writing policies, and maybe some people in commercial space might sort of scoff at that because it can be slow and time-consuming, and expensive. But sometimes there's a plus side to that, where if you step back and consider something and write a deliberate policy for a large organization, it's beneficial. In the DoD, for instance, they took a deliberate look at open source and they said, okay, well, let's consider how we want to integrate this from a business perspective. And by that I mean procurement, et cetera. And how do we consider it from a technology perspective? And for instance, Daniel Reisacher released a memo a few years back, which basically said, after some study, open source technology should be considered on an equal plane to commercial. So in other words, I'm not saying that it should have any advantages to being open source. In other words, everyone should just use open source. I'm not saying commercial is necessarily better. It needs to be considered as a sort of COTS product, if you will. And with a COTS product, right, you need to have support. No one would dream, I don't think, of running Oracle in production without support or some commercial product or IBM. The same thing applies for open source. So he's saying, okay, there's massive cost savings benefits from using open source in the DoD. There's efficiency gains in the mission. Allows you to innovate because you can start building things in developmental systems before even talking to a vendor or paying any money. But once you get ready to field this, right, you need commercial support for that to ensure that it's successful, right? Because if you think about it, one problem with the technology, if you have the experts doing it, is going to be probably solved 1,000 times faster than having a whole bunch of people that are not necessarily experts. So I think this sort of deliberate study and consideration of open source from a product perspective by DoD is pretty cool, actually. I mean, you don't really see this level of introspection and sort of policy in the government. So sometimes, in the commercial side, so it exists for a reason. Sometimes it's a strength. So I mean, that's one thing. And I think now, now that the government agencies are starting to release more of their own efforts, people like CFPB, I think that's going to push commercial further down the direction. I mean, clearly, I think they were doing that. Some companies were doing that, but usually the companies that were doing that were sort of the web companies of the world, Yahoos and Amazons and stuff. But I think now some of the stodgier Wall Street companies are realizing that they stand to benefit from open sourcing and allowing people to collaborate on their software. So I would say those are sort of two things that could stand to gain. In thinking about what government's doing with open source.
Right. And so looking forward, how do you see this open source adoption evolving?
Well, I mean, if I just circle back to my discussion of the business model, I think I think that is going to continue to drive adoption in the sense that, companies, so take Mongo DB for instance, when our founders created the product, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that they were going to make an open source project, right? They got that, Dwight and Ellie got in a garage with a bunch of other smart guys, and they spent 2 years, building this out, and they said, well, what's the best way to get it out there, right? And the best way was open source. And this sort of differs from sort of the traditional way you think of open source, where, it's a community project and there's a lot of good software over 10, 20 years or, less. And then a commercial company says, well, someone needs to support it and we're going to glom onto it. Now it's actually the opposite. People are creating products and say open source is the best way to put it out there. And so I think the effect is that just more and more open source is going onto the market, right? Because the business model, the maturity is there. And it's really, it's an exciting time. In fact, I would almost say that open source is sort of a default consideration when you're releasing an enterprise software. Right? So, if I'm building an application designed towards an end user with very targeted domain, from a business perspective, it might not make sense to go open source, right? But if I'm doing an enterprise technology that's going to get vast adoption across large scales of people, then open source makes sense. So I think, more and more software is going to come on the market. It's funny actually even just saying on the market, because that sort of contrasts with the traditional open source. And that's going to drive adoption. And certainly, the government's financial issues are pretty well understood. So, they're looking for ways to save money. And, open source technologies save money not just from a license perspective, but, save money from a personnel perspective, right? Because typically there's a lot of time savings with these technologies, right? IT spend for any given organization is usually, 10% tops? It's the people that cost a lot of money. And so if you can find ways to gain efficiencies in their time, if you allow a person to start building demos and prototyping instantly with software that you can easily understand or enhance it or leverage stuff that's already out there, that's massive cost savings. So the future is really bright. And like I said, I just think sort of enterprise software companies that take a commercial model, they're going to be a thing of the past. I honestly think so. They're going to be dinosaurs. So yeah, it's exciting. It's a very exciting time.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
This is FedScoopTV. I'm Colby Hockmuth.